the man suddenly heard the blaring of an alarm and quickly turned his head, only to see a squad of Soviet soldiers charging toward him. Immediately after, the Soviet commissar questioned him, asking whether he owned a cow, a horse, and a few acres of land. Terrified, the man didn't dare lie and hastily nodded in admission, but to his shock, the commissar declared, "You're a kulak, part of the privileged exploitative class. According to government policy, as of this moment, all your land and livestock are confiscated." The man anxiously explained that the cow was for plowing, the horse was for hauling, and he was just an ordinary farmer, not an exploiter. But the commissar ignored him completely, ordering him to surrender his land and animals by sundown, as everything he owned now belonged to the state. With that, the commissar turned around, smiling with satisfaction, and walked away. But before he could leave the yard, a father and son suddenly appeared in front of him. It turned out they were also ordinary farmers, furious after having their land taken, and had come determined to reclaim it by force. Sensing their intent, the Soviet soldiers quickly reached for their guns. Seeing this, the others mounted their horses and gave chase in anger, hiding nearby. Yuri saw his grandfather and father being pursued and immediately rushed out in a wagon, pretending to be a passerby to block the soldiers, but his attempt to stall them didn't help much. In the end, Yuri's father and grandfather engaged in a fierce battle with the Soviets in the forest. Though they were agile and fought bravely, they were outnumbered. By the time Yuri arrived at the woods, his father was already hanging lifeless from a tree. Crying out in anguish, he rushed forward and cut his father down, but the man was already gone. Only his grandfather had survived. Wounded by a bullet, Yuri, overwhelmed with grief, said a heartbreaking farewell to his beloved father, memories of their time together flashing through his mind. His hatred for the Soviet soldiers reached its peak, and he silently vowed to avenge his father. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership convened a high-level meeting to address the national food shortage. They decided to target Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, though some warned this would bring immense suffering to Ukrainians and could spark rebellion. The leadership insisted that sacrificing Ukraine was a price worth paying for the greater Soviet good. Soon after, food taxes in Ukraine doubled, and wave after wave of grain was shipped out. Those who protested, refused to hand over food, or hid grain were publicly executed for treason. Yuri once again spotted the same commissar who had killed his father and wanted to rush forward and kill him on the spot. But thoughts of his new wife Natalka, his mother, and his grandfather held him back, and he forced himself to suppress his rage. With their land taken and food supplies seized, Yuri's family grew increasingly desperate. His grandfather handed him a dagger, his father's most cherished weapon, believing there was no future for them here. He urged Yuri to take Natalka and seek a new life in Kiev. That night, Yuri said goodbye and headed to the train station with Natalka. But just as the train was about to depart, Natalka changed her mind. She wanted to stay behind to care for Yuri's mother and grandfather. Though heartbroken, Yuri had no choice but to board the train to Kiev alone. Neither of them could have imagined that this farewell might be forever. He never expected that a quick sketch he drew to pass the time would receive such high praise from a stranger. The man told him, "With your talent, working in a factory would be a waste." He encouraged Yuri to use his art to show the world the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Saying that, the man stepped off the train. As Yuri pondered the man's words, he suddenly heard a noise outside the window. He looked out and saw that same man being brutally beaten by Soviet soldiers. Though filled with sympathy, Yuri could do nothing but watch helplessly. Soon, he arrived at the Kiev train station, his first time in a big city after growing up in the countryside. He looked around with wide-eyed curiosity. He thought he could find work in Kiev and send money back home to support his family. But instead, he found that life in Kiev was even worse everywhere he looked. Starving people lay dying in the streets. To solve food shortages elsewhere, the Soviets kept draining grain from Ukraine, the so-called breadbasket of Europe, carting it away by the trainload. This only deepened the suffering of Ukrainian citizens and laid the groundwork for a massive famine. Yuri had hoped Kiev would bring job opportunities and income for his family. But the unemployment rate was far beyond what he had imagined. Despite searching tirelessly, he couldn't find a suitable job. Then one day, he received a letter from Natalka. She wrote that the Soviets had raised grain taxes again, making life even harder. His grandfather had been forced to slaughter his beloved white horse just to survive, and Natalka revealed she was pregnant. Overjoyed to learn he would become a father, Yuri also realized this meant even more expenses. With no luck finding work, he resolved to pursue an art-related job, convinced that his talent would lead him forward. But his drawings were dismissed as shallow and soulless. Listening to the criticism and advice, Yuri nodded, half understanding. That night, he saw a truck on the street loaded with corpses. This marked the beginning of the 2-year Ukrainian famine. Every day, countless people died of hunger. Anti-Soviet resistance groups started to emerge everywhere. Still jobless, Yuri began to find hope in one such group. He eventually found work at a scrapyard barely enough to survive. As time went on, the streets filled with more and more starving beggars. Most, like Yuri, had lost their land and come to the city seeking survival. But the city, no matter how big, couldn't shelter them all. Watching so many people on the brink of death, Yuri was filled with rage, but could only stand by in silence. One day, a child tugged at his sleeve, begging him to save his mother. With no other choice, Yuri shared half his dinner with the boy, Lubko. Lubko ran to give the food to his mother, but no matter how he shook or called her, she never moved again. Knowing Lubko was now alone, Yuri took him in. He brought Lubko to a restaurant, hoping to give him a proper meal. But there, they witnessed several Soviet soldiers beating a Ukrainian man. His only crime, playing a Ukrainian folk song. Images of his fathers hanging flashed through Yuri's mind, and fury took over. He lunged at the soldiers and managed to land a few blows, but he was outnumbered, and the soldiers quickly overwhelmed him. During the scuffle, one soldier was accidentally killed, beaten nearly to death. Yuri was thrown into prison. 1 month later, in the middle of the night, he and other anti-Soviet prisoners were taken to the execution grounds. Watching those ahead of him fall one by one, panic overtook him. When it was his turn to face the rifles, all his bravery vanished. As the soldiers raised their guns, Yuri's legs buckled and he collapsed in fear. At that moment, he realized he wasn't as courageous as he thought. He didn't want to die, he just wanted to live, even if it meant groveling like a dog. Seeing him trembling on his knees, the warden suddenly called off the execution. Stunned, Yuri looked up, and the warden smiled at him in delight. And just like that, Yuri survived. After this near-death experience, Yuri missed his family terribly, especially Natalka. All he wanted was to be by her side and live in peace. He drew her image on the prison wall and spent his days talking to it. One day, the warden saw the drawing and entered the cell with a gun. He ordered Yuri to paint his deceased lover from memory. To soothe his aching heart, Yuri seized the moment, asking to write a letter to his own love. And so, the two men bonded over their shared longing and made a deal. Yuri poured his soul into a heartfelt letter to Natalka. Though he had only one page, halfway through, he realized he would likely die in this hellhole. Determined to survive and return to Natalka, he planned his escape. The next morning, while painting under the warden's supervision, Yuri suddenly struck and killed him with a paintbrush. He took the warden's gun and keys, unlocked his cell, and escaped through the prison's drainage system. But soon, the guards discovered the murder and the breakout. They immediately launched a deadly pursuit. Yuri ran for his life, not daring to stop for even a second. Fortunately, the heavy snowfall quickly covered his tracks on the ground. Yuri finally managed to escape the guards and fled into the forest. There, he unexpectedly spotted a wild rabbit, and with his stomach growling from hunger, he didn't hesitate to raise his gun and shoot. But just as he was carefully roasting the rabbit over a fire, he suddenly heard a noise behind him. Startled, he jumped up with his gun ready, only to find that it wasn't the pursuers but Lubko, the boy he had taken in for less than a day. And Lubko wasn't alone, he was now with a group of homeless children, forming a small gang of strays. All the children stared silently at the rabbit meat beside Yuri, their eyes full of longing. Kind-hearted as ever, Yuri didn't hesitate to share the rabbit meat with the kids. As they huddled around the fire, tearing into the meat, a few men suddenly appeared beside them. Yuri instantly drew his gun, but when the men confirmed he was Ukrainian, they slowly lowered their weapons. It turned out one of them was a local anti-Soviet rebel commander. He told Yuri they were planning to attack a Soviet unit the next day, and as a fellow Ukrainian, Yuri was expected to join the assault. Yuri had originally planned to keep running, to return to his hometown and reunite with Natalka, but faced with the man's stern demand, he had no choice but to nod and agree. At dawn the next day, they waited anxiously in the woods by the roadside, armed with whatever they could find: knives, forks, clubs. Eventually, a Soviet unit appeared in their line of sight. With a shout from the cavalry commander, the mounted soldiers charged at the Soviets. Roaring with fury, Yuri's infantry unit followed close behind, rising from their hiding spots and rushing forward. Caught off guard, the Soviet troops didn't retreat, they quickly regrouped and formed a tight defensive line. The rebels, with their poor equipment, suffered heavy losses immediately, but the cavalry, driven by sheer courage, managed to break through to the Soviet front. Yuri quickly lit a Molotov cocktail, mounted a horse, and rode straight toward the Soviet machine gun cart. Seizing his moment, he hurled the Molotov, destroying the machine gun nest that had been mowing them down. The horses pulling the cart panicked from the blast and scattered, and the fire from the explosion ignited a barrel of gunpowder. Before Yuri could get away, he was thrown violently to the ground by the explosion. After the battle, Lubko, who had once stayed with Yuri for less than a day, desperately searched through the corpses for him. He dropped to the ground beside Yuri, shaking him and calling his name. Yuri finally woke up in response to Lubko's cries, but since Yuri was a fugitive, he knew he couldn't stay and take care of Lubko. He decided they had to part ways and survive on their own. But Lubko, with no family left, refused to leave him. He had seen Yuri as family ever since he shared his dinner that night. Eventually, they reached a train station, but with no money for tickets. They planned to hide in a freight car at the back. However, when Yuri opened the door, a horrible stench hit them in the face. Inside, the car was filled with corpses of civilians who had died from starvation. Despite the overwhelming smell, Yuri steeled himself and climbed inside with Lubko because they had to get home. They curled up together, holding their noses, waiting for the train to start moving. In that moment, it wasn't just the smell. They were both shaken to the core by the sight of so many bodies. They didn't know how long it took, but they finally arrived at their destination. To avoid being discovered, they jumped off the train early. By chance, they landed near a temporary Soviet grain depot. Lubko ran up and began shouting insults at the Soviet soldiers unloading grain. The angry soldiers chased after him, but were ambushed by Yuri, who knocked one out cold. Another soldier stepped out of the depot looking for his missing comrade, only to be captured by Yuri on the spot. Helpless, the soldier was forced to become Yuri's driver. Yuri hijacked the truck and headed straight for his hometown. On the way, near a wooden bridge, Yuri saw bodies of starved civilians being dumped into a ravine. After crossing the bridge, he saw more emaciated people begging for food on the roadside. The sight filled him with rage. His concern for Natalka and his family soared to the limit. Furious, he raised his gun, ready to shoot the Soviet soldier beside him. He blamed them for seizing grain and causing so many deaths. He turned all his anger on the soldier, but the soldier explained that he was just following orders. He was powerless to stop the suffering. No matter how the soldier pleaded, Yuri dragged him out of the truck. He wanted revenge for his fellow Ukrainians, but Lubko clung to Yuri, begging him to spare the man's life. The boy had seen too much death. He didn't want to witness one more, even if it was a Soviet soldier he hated. Yuri hesitated. In the end, he let the man live. The three of them continued toward Yuri's village in the truck. Soon, they spotted a Soviet checkpoint ahead. Yuri ordered the soldier to pull over, unsure if the man would betray them, but the soldier calmly drew his gun and said, "I could have killed you all earlier, but I didn't." Hearing that, Yuri said nothing more. In the end, the soldier drove them safely through the checkpoint. By evening, they finally reached Yuri's hometown. Before entering the village, Yuri saw an old friend lying weakly by the roadside, on the brink of death. Worried, Yuri asked about his family, but the friend said nothing. They were all dead from starvation. Helplessly, Yuri tried to comfort him, saying he had brought a whole truck of grain. At those words, a glimmer of hope lit up in the man's eyes. Yuri told him to share the food with everyone in the village, while he took Lubko and ran toward home. Seeing Yuri suddenly appear in the distance, Natalka rushed out of the house, eyes wide with disbelief and joy. She had thought he died in Kiev. Now, after so long without a word, he stood alive before her. The two lovers embraced tightly, but the next second, Natalka's joy turned to sorrow. Through tears, she told Yuri that due to malnutrition, their unborn child had died. The news crushed Yuri. His heart felt like it had collapsed. Though heartbroken, he gently told her, "We may have lost our child, but life has given us another gift." He introduced Lubko to Natalka, the boy he had taken in during his journey, but Lubko thought Yuri no longer needed him and quietly turned to leave. When Yuri called his name, Lubko lit up and ran toward him with all his strength. Lubko had no parents, and Yuri and Natalka had lost their child brought together by tragedy. The three of them formed a new family. Months later, Yuri finally stood before his mother again, but she was so weak from prolonged starvation that she was close to death. Yuri handed her the food he had brought, but she no longer had the strength to eat. Seeing her like that, Yuri was heartbroken and speechless. Natalka told him that his grandfather had been caught stealing food from a Soviet depot and was imprisoned, his fate still unknown. His mother looked at Yuri, her eyes full of words she could never say. With her last bit of strength, she reached up to touch his face, and then quietly passed away. It was as if she had held onto her final breath just to see her son one last time. Only then did Yuri truly understand if they stayed in Ukraine, they would all die like this. So he stood up in anger, vowing to take everyone across the border into Poland, where they might actually survive. But first, he had to rescue his grandfather. Natalka agreed, and quickly handed Yuri his grandfather's military dagger. Meanwhile, the villagers gathered together to share the food Yuri had brought. But somehow, the Soviet commissar had gotten word and dispatched troops. Without warning, the soldiers opened fire on the villagers. The Soviet soldier who had helped Yuri protect the food also pulled his gun to defend the people and gave his life in the process. Yuri used the chaos to sneak into the prison with his friend and ambushed 2 guards. They opened the cell doors and freed all the imprisoned villagers, including Yuri's grandfather. But just then, the commissar returned with reinforcements. A fierce battle erupted. Yuri's friend drove a truck loaded with grenades straight into the Soviet troops to clear a path, and his grandfather stayed behind to take the commissar down with him. After fighting all night, Yuri lost his grandfather and his best friend. Grieving, he fled with Natalka and Lubko under the cover of darkness. They planned to stow away on a train to the border, then find a way into Poland to escape Soviet control. Eventually, they arrived near the border. The 3 jumped off the train and ran without stopping, but a Soviet guard spotted them and blew his whistle to alert others. The soldiers opened fire as they gave chase, running as fast as they could. The 3 dodged bullets. Natalka twisted her ankle and urged Yuri to leave her behind, but Yuri refused to abandon her. He hoisted her onto his back and kept running. At last, they reached the border river. If they could cross it, freedom awaited on the other side. Without hesitation, they dove into the water. The Soviets fired at them from the riverbank. They swam underwater with everything they had. Bullets whizzed past their heads, and the other side felt endlessly far. They gave it their all, but it felt like they might never make it. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.